Welcome to the first episode of Wheel ORAMA. The rules are simple. Spin the first wheel to see what characters we're going to use. Then spin the second wheel to see what the setting for a diorama build will be. Earth was the setting for the first two Predator movies. Not a lot of in-space action to draw from. But Predator 2 did have a spaceship, which had its trophy room, and I thought that had to be the build, so that's what I went with. It was hard to make out the fine details of the trophy wall from the movie because the cuts were quick, so for reference, I went off the pics of the official nickel wall that they did. On most of my builds, I like to do a cardboard prototype first. That way I can get the scale down and walk through the build process in my head. When starting a new build, make sure you have a fresh blade so that your cuts come out nice and clean. Now by mistake, I glued the cardboard backwards and ended up with a blueberry trophy room, and that's why I do a practice run. You ready for the real build?
Yes, the build is ready!
I picked out my foam pieces and began to block out the wall segments. First, my lovely lady brought me some food. Next, I cut out the wall segments and blocked out where the shelf was going to be. The foam has a shiny top layer that does not hold paint very well. This can be fixed in early stages by sanding or cutting it off so that the foam takes the paint later. I gathered up my arsenal of building materials. It's all very important to make sure that you're staying hydrated and properly fed during the whole process. Then I sorted through my scraps to see what I could use visually that matched. I'm going to start a meal until you finish the meal. Straight and bendy straws work great for pipes and various tubing. I use cardboard to give some of the straws texture. The glue gun is my go-to, but that can get pretty messy. When the glue dries, it doesn't take paint well, so I made sure to go back and clean up the spots the glue bled out. The majority of this build was playing around with random parts from my toolbox that I have accumulated over the years and seeing what visually matched the shapes from the reference. Heat can manipulate the foam in various ways, so I used the heated tip of the glue gun to give me a perfect rounded corner. And for those of you who have fat fingers like me, I highly recommend adding a pair of tweezers to your tool bag for dealing with smaller parts. Before I got too ahead of myself, I wanted to make sure that I didn't build over the areas I wanted to place the skulls. I roughly outlined where I would want the skulls to live and continue to work on the wall details. As a kid, I'd spend more time setting up the scenery my figures would play in than I would actually playing. I'd make G.I. Joe bases out of Lincoln Logs and Legos so that they could all be destructible and Snake Eyes could kick somebody through the wall. So making dioramas in my old age gives me a creative outlet to play like a kid again. Use my imagination to look at household objects or things I'd normally throw away and see how I can turn them into playable environments. My new hobby has quickly turned into an obsession, which in turn has made my office look like a recycling depot. I have a box of assorted cardboard and other sized boxes, bins dedicated to varied plastic bits, bottles, caps, packing materials, wood, foam scraps, pretty much anything that looked cool, I started to hoard. Here's some quality of life tips. To keep your significant other happy and on board with your diorama obsession, make sure to keep your hoarding organized and to a reasonable limit. It's also important to keep your workspace free from as much clutter as you can. Your work area can overwhelm you quickly with cut scraps, foam dust, and unused bits and pieces. So take the time to pause on your work and clean up your area before it gets out of hand. I was finding that for the larger pipes, the straws were working perfectly, and for some of the smaller straight pipes, toothpicks and small dowel rods were doing the trick. But the trophy wall had many curved pipes that ran together, and I was having trouble finding the right material to use. Out of a process of elimination, I was able to discover that Q-tips are very bendable without them breaking like the toothpicks. Metal straws have two purposes in life: chipping your teeth and making perfect circle indents into foam. I'm fairly new to the Dio build game, having only done this for a couple months. My videos are not so much in the realm of tutorials or how-to videos, but more a follow-along of my builds as I continue to learn and hone my craft. Before I started any of my builds, I watched hours of videos on YouTube where there are some great channels that have awesome tutorials and just amazing work that they do.
First of all, thanks to everyone for helping put this
Diorama
together. And a very special shout out.
I've watched almost all of Black Magic Craft's videos, and even though he works on a scale for D&D tabletops, I was still able to take the knowledge and apply it to the larger scale that my figure collection is. It was cool to see over his 3 years of videos, both the progression of his builds and tips, as well as watching his setup upgrade over time. Check out his channel and enjoy going down the rabbit hole.
Lions, the tigers, the bears. Oh my.
It's now day 2 of putting together the back wall, and honestly, I was kind of done with gluing down a bunch of little bits and parts. To make sure there wasn't blank areas on the back wall, I drew in some details to speed up the process. And Viole, the back wall is done. At this stage, it looks like a yard sale of mismatched parts, but after the base coat, the details look more like the trophy wall. The base coat is made mainly of Mod Podge, a little water, and black paint. The Mod Podge helps to seal your work and gives the foam a plastic feel to it, so it comes off as something store-bought and not just crafted foam. It can take up to 3 coats to hide the pink from the foam and the original color of the plastics. I usually hit it with 2 coats, then let it sit overnight and hit it up with a 3rd the next morning if needed. Now it's time to move on to the shelf. The first one I made was too short and just didn't look good. I wasn't happy with it, and the lesson learned is that sometimes it's easier to start over than try to make a piece fit. So I tossed it out and started fresh. This go around, I decided to build up with multiple pieces instead of carving it out of just one. I used dowel rods wrapped with cut cereal box cardboard for the pipes on the left side and carved the workbench out of foam for the right side. I sanded down the sharp edges to give a curved look, along with sanding down the shiny parts of the foam. The original bench had parts that were exposed. To get that look, I first glued down the pipe and the bench, and then built the encasing pieces and glued them over. And then I added some straw parts and Q-tips to have different pipe textures on the bench and cut out the sidewall segments. After it was all glued into place, I covered all the seams with a quick drying spackle by hand because it was easier than using the putty knife. I gathered up the leftover scraps. There's a thin line between keeping good pieces that you can reuse and holding on to garbage. I hit the shelf with the same base coat and was pretty pleased with how the spackle job came out, seeing how it was the first time I was trying it on foam. Now that both parts are built and dried from the base coats, it was time to put them together. I measured and cut out the wall segments, making sure that they looked good before moving forward. Next, I drew out my line work to guide the cuts for both sides of the wall to make sure that I dug the look before I began to cut out anything. I liked what I saw and began cutting away the unwanted areas at different height levels to give the walls some depth. Once the cutting was finished, I kept the scraps I could reuse and tossed the rest. Now it was time to break out the big boy. For the back wall, I wanted to keep flat and smooth, so standing worked best. For the side walls, I didn't want them as smooth. I wanted to keep some texture to it. To accomplish this, I cut off the shiny layer in chunks and sanded out any parts that looked too chunky. I did the same process on the other side and was pleased with the results. Always safety first. Practice safe cutting techniques and make sure that you are storing away sharp objects safely. I dropped my blade once and it took out a chunk of my heel. Stay safe out there when building, folks. Next, I hit the walls with the base coat and blocked out the outer walls that would finish off my build. I wanted to mimic the transparency of the ship, so I went with Project Foam Board and peeled off the paper from both sides. The walls in the ship all had a curve to them, which I could match with the foam board because it has some give. So all I had to do was cut out some curved pink stuff and glue them bad boys together. I drew some Predator ship looking designs out of the thin scraps that I kept and glued them onto the foam board. The process was tedious, but I was happy with the final result. Now that the walls were all done, it was time to figure out how I was going to get the skulls to stay on the wall. I used the skull and spine that came with my Predator figure and found the other skulls on clearance at Michael's. It was for an excavation model set, but when I saw them, I knew that after a little repaint, they were meant for my Predators. The back of the skulls had an indent to them, so I carved out some small foam pieces that fit into the slots. I glued the skull stands to the back wall and hit it with a base coat. And now it's time to paint. For the walls, I went with Brick Red by Craftsmart. When painting foam and dios, using the cheap stuff works perfectly. I have a collection of Craftsmart, Apple Barrel, and Deco art. I don't have any loyalties to one brand. My only loyalty is to cost. It saves me the most money. Once I painted the walls, I did a light test to see how the foam transparency held up after being painted. And it looked pretty spot on to what I was going for. Before painting the back wall, I did a color test on the bottom to see if I liked how it looked. I did, and then so for the workbench, I went with Desert Sand by Deco Art and Dark Copper by Craftsmart for the back wall. There wasn't much to the paint job since it was basically a 2-color scheme and the back wall was only 1 color. After the paint job, I hit the whole wall up with a black wash to give it a used, grimy look to it all. I painted all the pieces before I glued them together, mainly because they were easily to handle in small segments opposed to one big-ass piece. But I double-clicked the record button, so we missed out on most of the process of putting the pieces together. But you get it. I glued them all together. And bam, it's done. The only thing missing now are the trophies and a sweet photo shoot.
Want some candy?
Follow Panels on Pages for more Wheel-O-Rama videos, and for future builds, follow Three-Legged Productions on YouTube and Instagram.